Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ship It and Sip It. I'm very excited to have another founder on the show today. His name is Chris Fernandes, and he is the founder of Bodii, which is a health tech startup based in the UK. Chris, welcome to the show.
Nice to see you, John.
All right. So, since the theme of the show is Ship It and Sip It, can you pick one thing that you've shipped recently that you'd like to tell the audience about?
I guess yesterday we shipped our marketing video for the boot camps that we're running, and that was a pretty funny experience recording it because I hate recording myself on camera, and so I did like 30 takes before sending the final one over.
Okay, well, and today you're recording this show again, so 2 days in a row in front of the camera. I guess I'm sorry, but thank you. Uh, yes, as well as being a founder, Chris is also the co-creator of the Paralect Bootcamp, which is our second main topic for today's show, along with Victoria Antonovich and Igor Krasnik from our team. So I guess we will start with your location and background a little bit. So you're based in the UK, spend a lot of time in Portugal as well. Tell us a little bit about the scenes there as a founder and what you've learned.
Yeah, so I've lived in the UK in Liverpool. Well, not only Liverpool, but I've lived in the UK for about five years now, about 5 or 6 years. I studied here as well in Liverpool, and I started being a founder here as well. Before here, I lived in Portugal, where I finished high school. So yeah, I enjoyed living in Liverpool purely because I find it to be a way smaller version of a city like London, for example, and it's way more cozy than a place like Manchester, in my opinion. And for anyone who's been to Manchester and Liverpool would probably spot the difference because everything's really close together, and it's quite normal to see a lot of people that you might have seen before. In terms of the startup scene, I guess it's kind of similar in that aspect that it's really cozy. So like you go to a lot of startup events in the region and you tend to see similar faces every time. So you can be quite friendly with them. You know you can rely on them, and you probably see them walking around some of the startup areas around the city. So for example, in Liverpool, we've got an area called the Baltic Triangle where a lot of the tech startups are based. Um, and you tend to see a lot of familiar faces that you can ask questions, you can rely upon, and you can just have a quick chat with.
Sounds great. Yeah. I guess let's dive into how you and Victoria connected and sort of the genesis for the boot camp.
Yeah, it was. I wouldn't say it's a funny story, but it was kind of just a we we connected on LinkedIn, and then I happened to be in Lisbon in December, around just before Christmas time, and I knew that Victoria was based in Lisbon, and we just decided to go for a coffee to talk about startups because I knew she was the founder of Altos, and she was working at Paralect, and obviously as the founder of a startup myself and someone who's worked at venture studios, I thought there'd probably be a lot of knowledge sharing, but just nice to get to know people in the startup community. And I actually at that point did know anyone from the startup community that lived in Lisbon, so it was quite an interesting way to do that. Um, we kind of just met for a coffee and we spoke for about 2 hours about um, how difficult it is sometimes for founders to build traction, how difficult it is to navigate fundraising sometimes as first time founders. Um, but also a bit about the challenges we both face working at venture studios. So it was kind of a really good general discussion on startups in the community.
Cool. And that happened in December, and the boot camp is already launching in February. So it's a very short time frame. So tell us about that process. How did you really flesh out the idea, and how did you guys make it happen so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing is that it was never a formal conversation. It wasn't like, let's sit down and create a project plan. we kind of shared ideas. We met twice while I was in Lisbon and just carried on. I'd say discussing it into January, and then by the end of January, Victoria was like, "Yeah, we want to do it. Paralect wants to do it. We'll kind of bring you on board. Let's work together, and we'll make this happen." And that was like on a Thursday, and then by Monday the following week, or maybe it was the week after, we kind of just got started on creating a project plan. But the crazy thing is, it wasn't like we started creating it on day one of when I started working with Paralect. It was kind of, we already started discussing it back in December when we first met, and it was kind of just putting everything to paper then, and then trying to formalize it a bit more, getting a landing page up and running. And I mean, on I kind of started formally working on the bootcamp on Monday. On the Tuesday and Wednesday, we drew up a project plan. Thursday, Friday, got a landing page up, and the following week, we started marketing it. So it was really quick, and I guess that's the best way to learn and get to market.
Yeah. Speaking of the landing page, it is at bootcamp.paralect.com. So go check it out. You can see more about the program and also apply if you're a founder that wants to be part of it. I guess let's go back to basics a little bit. So who's it for, and what is the main goal in your perspective?
So I guess I'll speak about this bootcamp from a founder perspective to begin with. And the ideal founders we want to work with are idea stage tech founders. So people who have an idea, they might not necessarily have a tech background or any tech background to begin with, but they think that tech might be able to solve that problem. So a great example that I use, and it's actually a friend who started a software business. He was a veterinarian. He spotted a problem in the vet industry, and he kind of started working to solve that problem. And that's the type of founder we want to work with. So someone who works in an industry, whatever domain it might be, they spot a problem and they think tech might solve it, but they don't necessarily know what the next step is. And I guess when it comes to that next step, it's probably about validating whether there is a business there. So one of the biggest risks that most people who have been in the startup world already know is building something that nobody needs or something that's not of value to anyone. And the whole goal of the bootcamp is actually to help founders figure that out, to see whether there is value in what they're creating. But I think from looking at it from a founder perspective, more deeper, a lot of founders don't actually know whether their heart is in a business until they've actually started working on it and actually started getting into the market. So you might have a great idea and you're sitting at home, but it's not actually a business until you go on and start speaking to customers. And what happens is that you might go speak to a lot of customers, and the answers they might give you might not resonate with you. It might be wrong. It might invalidate your idea. It might invalidate your whole hypothesis. And you might decide, like, this startup isn't for me. And I think the goal behind the bootcamp is that founders can probably figure that out in 1 month, rather than sitting on an idea for about 3 years and saying, I've always wanted to do that. I have an idea. It's going to be the next big thing. And it's always just an idea. So it's kind of try to expedite that process.
Right. And one of the things, or two of the things that people keep talking about when it comes to early stage startups and ideas, pre-MVP product ideas, is validation. And what's the main centerpiece of the bootcamp is traction. So maybe just for someone who doesn't have a firm understanding of those two concepts, what are the differences or similarities between validation and early traction for a startup?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of validation, it's trying to see whether there is a problem that needs solving, and then trying to figure out whether that problem is important enough to someone that it can actually turn into a business. So that's where validation is really important, and it becomes valuable when talking to investors in the future or when creating marketing material in the future, because you're able to communicate what the business is actually doing much more effectively, having gone through a process of problem validation or solution validation. In terms of traction, and that's the big buzzword whenever you're fundraising. Every investor is going to be like, what traction do you have? And there's no one's ever going to have enough traction. So that's the starting point. So sometimes founders are like, okay, do I need 20 signups and will you invest? And it's like, no. um, I'm never going to say you need X amount of signups or X amount of traction. I don't know what the number is. I'm not experienced enough, and I don't think anyone really is experienced enough to say what the actual number is. But what we can do is create targets and see how long it takes to get there, and then kind of um, compare whether there is as much of a pull as we think, and then kind of see what the results are that way. Um, I think traction for founders is the best way of demonstrating that there is a market out there. So a lot of people go through the process of getting people to sign up on a form. They might get businesses to give them a letter of intent. They might get emails, any form of communication with customers. All that is traction because it's showing that there are people out there who have an interest in what you're doing. Investors love that because no one's going to invest in just an idea. And as the fundraising climate becomes a bit more difficult for founders, the bar gets higher. And so the more evidence you can show that you're a good founder who can execute on the idea, the better. And I guess traction helps a founder too. So if you've got an idea and you raise £100,000 and you spend 6 months building product and you've not actually got any customers signed up who are willing to test it out, who are willing to work with you, do interviews, give you feedback on product, you're kind of putting yourself in a difficult position because you've not really got any feedback to go off from the people that are actually going to become your customers or users. So I guess building traction before even having a product gives you a pipeline of people you can rely on to give you valuable feedback. So it kind of helps you in fundraising, but it also helps you in product development.
Very interesting. Thank you. That's very helpful, I think, to myself and anybody who's considering joining. All right, so let's talk about the name for a minute because, bootcamp is a pretty common term. It has a lot of associations. There are military boot camps where you learn very quickly how to be a soldier. There are fitness boot camps where you get in shape very quickly in an intense cohort setting. There are coding boot camps where people learn how to program and become developers. So the premise is all pretty uniform. It's a short, intense training program. Is that sort of why you guys went with it for startups? How is it any different in this situation?
Yeah, so I think we really don't want it to come across as a course. We're not going to give lectures. We're not going to give essays, and we're not going to give anyone homework. I'm not qualified enough to do that, and I don't think anyone can really say they're qualified to do that. But I think what we can do is, in a really short amount of time, give people the tools to just go out and do it on their own. And that's the whole idea behind it, because it's not easy speaking to customers, and it's not easy being humbled by a lot of them as well. That's probably one of the things a lot of founders will find out during bootcamp. A lot of the founders that are going to come on also will likely have full-time jobs, and that's going to make it difficult as well. So I guess the whole idea behind the name Bootcamp is, like you say, a short program that's quite intensive, but it's not necessarily a learning course. It's more of how can we help founders and give them the tools really quickly to get stuff done.
Right on. And on the site, you've outlined that it should be five founders per cohort. How did you sort of come to that size, and why do you think it's important that there is at least a small group of founders to learn together?
Yeah, I guess it's got to be small enough that we can add enough value. to each one to begin with, and then it's got to be big enough that the founders get enough value from each other. Um, because it's the first boot camp that we're running, we also want to learn from it, right? So although we're running the boot camps, we're not going to say that we're absolutely amazing at it. It's a learning curve for Parallax as well. So I think if we have a small, cozy group of founders that have the right energy, are willing to do the work, they can feed back to us and we can build on that. I don't think there'll ever be a situation where we're running a boot camp for 20 founders unless we actually grow into maybe 3 or 4 Chris's and Victorias. But I think this way we can work closely with founders. They get the most out of us. We can actually add value through Parallax channels, to our channels. And on the back end of it, it actually helps them because they're starting to get their tiny communities of people they trust. Being a founder is a lonely place sometimes. And so having a small group of people who are in the same stage as you, going through the exact same process, you can share ideas, you can share difficulties, challenges, wins, and I think that's what a small group of 5 allows.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So thinking back on your, or not even back, but just thinking about your experience as a founder, what do you want new founders to learn, or how has that your founder experience informed what you want to deliver to founders through this program?
Yeah, so I think I want it to be very much founders talking to founders. So I've gone through the process of problem validation. I've gone through the process of having to build up traction before getting investment for Bodii. And I've worked with a lot of founders who were in the same position and had 0 sign-up, 0 users, and have gone on to build a bit of traction and get investment. And I think that's something that gives me a lot of energy. And I think speaking to founders as someone who's been in that position and who has found it difficult speaking to customers, who has gone door to door, trying to talk to them, get them to sign up, try to demo product, try to be unbiased. I think that's really valuable. And the difference with maybe sometimes accelerators, not so much, is that not necessarily a negative, is that sometimes you get a lot of VCs and investors giving advice when they've not actually gone through that early stage of trying to build up the business. And that's not to discredit them. They obviously know what businesses require to survive and build and raise enough capital. And I'm not gonna sit here and run the program and say I've gone on to be a successful founder. Absolutely no means. I would never categorize myself as that, and I don't think Victoria would either. But we have gone through that earliest stages of trying to get that key bit of traction to then raise our first round each and get to some form of MVP and product. And I think founders listening to other founders benefit that way.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about who were some of your key mentors as a founder? And maybe you don't have to name names, but what were some of the key ways that they helped you? And maybe it's a very similar question, but how was that learning experience for you? Did you have sort of a cohort of founders to bounce ideas off of, or was it just a social network?
I never really went out looking for mentors. I was naturally really good at speaking to people, I think, and making friends. Making friends in the startup community, I guess. I'm really transparent, and I think I'm quite down to earth in my approach. And I think when you speak to people who have been in the industry and you ask them for help, they've always been, people are kind, and startup founders are really kind because they know what the struggle is of building that early stages. I guess for me, I've always used close family as my mentorship arm, but I mean, a couple of years ago, I met a guy who I worked with closely up here in Liverpool, and just not a startup founder, worked with startups, and I've seen a lot of startups go on to raise capital. Um, and it's someone I probably lean on a lot regularly now as well whenever I have challenges. But I don't think you necessarily have to have someone who's an exited founder be a mentor, but someone who's really level-headed, who can give you a neutral viewpoint, tell you the pros and cons, be honest with you, look at things from a new light. That's what I look for in someone to help with. There's a couple of people that I talk to regularly like that, and I think it helps. I don't think a founder having to reach out to an exited entrepreneur for XYZ million is necessary. You just need someone who's going to be a bit rational, who's going to ask you the right questions and let you figure it out on your own. And that's what some of the people who I've worked with have given me.
Very good perspective. Thanks for sharing. So let's talk a little bit about how the bootcamp sort of fits into the overall structure of different programs and services within Parallax, because we have quite a few things going on. We've got the bootcamp, we've got the accelerator, we've got Kickstart, we've got the venture studio. Pavel and the guys are also working on starting up the VC fund. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I want to see how you and Victoria think that where does the bootcamp sit within the overall?
Yeah, so I think to be able to execute on all those arms, we need to create a really good relationship with the early stage founders, because if you start building that relationship when they're at the earliest stages, it's going to benefit the business in the longer term. So when you think about what Parallax traditionally done is provide a lot of software development for tech startups, and that's not where the business wants to be in the long term because of various reasons, and we want to grow and we want to work with startups more closely. But in order to be able to invest in businesses in the long term, we need to have a really good deal flow of startups to begin with at the beginning stages. So by running boot camps, we're working with founders at the earliest stages, ones who aren't ready for accelerators, ones who don't know who their customers are yet or what problem they're solving for their customers. Now, if we can add value to them then, watch them grow in a short amount of time, watch them build an MVP, go out, fundraise. Ideally, we can see them come back to us. Maybe it's for software development, maybe it's to join the accelerator. And it kind of would allow us to work with that startup not only for 1 month, but we can work with them from the conception right up to the later stages where they might be, raising their Series A maybe, or whatnot. We might be investors in the long term, who knows, but it's all about creating that early relationship so that we can be with them throughout the journey. And that's how we see it to begin with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit about the current situation for startups in terms of funding and sort of getting in a position to grow and raise the funds they need to launch and grow their product. So is it different now, do you think? What's the vibe in the UK with the current downturn and sort of the pressure from VCs to raise the bar to raise funding?
It's a challenge. Everyone wants traction. I can't sit here and tell you how it's changed over the past 10 years. I have no idea. I've not even been in the industry for that long. All I can talk about is what I've come across. I mean, last year I spoke to quite a few investors for Bodii. I've spoken to a lot of founders who have been speaking to investors, and I can only share my thoughts from that perspective. It's really, really challenging, and most investors are looking for, as always, the least risky bets in most cases. I think that makes it that puts a lot of pressure on early stage founders because they've got to do a lot more with a lot less. So finding the right co-founder, not wasting a lot of time really early on when they've got limited funds, all that becomes really, really important. And that's why things like boot camps are important, because if a founder can figure out key components of their business in 1 month rather than taking 6 months of runway, that's going to help them get to a better position to fundraise. I think a lot of founders start to get this impression that fundraising is really straightforward, and you have an idea, you put a business plan or a pitch deck together, and you call up a bunch of investors, you go have the calls, and maybe you might get a 20% success rate, and that's completely not the case. It actually takes a lot longer for a startup to get to the point where they're really investable, and that is comprised of things like having the right team, having enough traction, being able to articulate whether there is a growing market or not. Are you solving a problem for a large group? Are you solving a good problem for a large group of people? All these types of questions come up, and I think if some founders can't articulate that well, it's probably going to be a really difficult time raising. I see a lot of people that are raising out in the US, and there's a lot more money flying around, and so that bar isn't as high, at least from my perspective. But I think in the UK it's quite difficult at the moment. So getting as much done leanly while you're still got an income is probably the best thing a founder can do. Watching movies and seeing people quit their jobs to run a startup also is not the best advice for founders at the idea stage, because you're talking about a really tiny fraction of businesses that go on to do that. And I guess I look at it from the risk point of view, and I think there's so much a founder can do to make sure that there is a business there and to get the validation they need from customers to then go on and fundraise properly.
Right. And I guess the success stories always make the headlines. So if you read the news about startups, then you're reading a lot about ones that raise successfully. And it can sort of muddy the waters a bit. But I wanted to bring up one point that you mentioned there, which you also mentioned on a recent LinkedIn post. And that was you're looking for founders who are working probably full-time, but also willing to come into the bootcamp and build in public, as we say, about their new idea. So I'm curious if that is in any way a limiter for people, especially if they're looking to start a startup in the same domain that they're already working in. Is there a contradiction there, or am I just misreading the situation?
Yeah, and it's a tricky place to be for founders. A lot of companies make it difficult for people to have outside interests. They'd rather it be playing basketball than running a startup. And I think open-minded companies know that having an employee have ambitions outside of their actual job will actually benefit them, because you learn a lot as a founder that helps you in your actual work. But I think it's always going to be a struggle for a founder who doesn't feel comfortable speaking about their startup. I can't really advise them on what to do if they have a full-time job and want to build in public. It's kind of down to them, but it's going to limit us in terms of the founders we bring in. But at the same time, that's kind of how it has to be when you're running a startup, because if you're not willing to speak to customers and talk to the community about it, you're probably going to find it difficult to get anywhere with that idea, really, in my opinion, at least. But there's probably ways around it. You could decide you want to switch careers. get a job that allows you to do it. I mean, I joined Parallel, and Parallel loves that I've got Bodii as well, because I'm learning a lot from both of it. But I could be in another company and it could have been the complete opposite. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Let's see. You have actually worked in venture studios other than Paralect before. So uh, tell us a little bit about that experience, if you don't mind. And also, why do you think that this model is a good way to go about building startups?
Yeah, I loved working at a venture studio. I kind of did some similar work in terms of working with the earlier stage founders, running venture readiness programs, and it was amazing work. Probably added so much to me as a founder myself. Um, working with a bunch of startups. I think the the great thing about working with venture studios is having the support network and team around you. So I guess if you look at it from three 3 points really, is you get the processes. So venture studios have worked with a lot of startups and they can use a lot of those learnings on new businesses. So if I'm a first time founder coming into a venture studio, I can probably rely on the fact that that venture studio has probably gone through the process, made mistakes, learned from them with about 10 or 20 other startups before actually coming to my startup. So there's the repeatable processes. Um, you've Most venture studios are started by founders who have gone on to who have exited or have built really great products and now want to help other startups. So you've got that co-founding team. So when I go to fundraise in the future, I can say, I'm a shareholder, but my co-founder is this awesome company that has done all these things. They've worked with all these businesses, they've exited. So they know my co-founder knows what I'm doing. So you're not referring to your co-founder as a individual, but you're referring to your co-founder as an entity that has probably done some really cool things in the past. Um, and then you also benefit from financing, I guess. So the whole model of venture studios or startup studios is based around um, putting resources and money into businesses when they're at day zero, probably day zero, probably a little more than that. So you get the benefit of financing in that perspective. But I guess if you've got a venture studio that's got a portfolio of about 10 or 15 companies, each of them might have different investors. And then you've got access to a wider pool of investors who understand the model really well. They understand what it's like to be part of a venture studio. So I guess those are the big positives. I was reading a report earlier and it kind of outlined kind of the speed for a startup to get from day zero to their seed round. And for a venture studio, it's about 10.7 months. And then for an average startup to get to their seed, traditional startup without the venture studio, it takes about 3 years. So you can get to market really, really quickly and get to the point where you're raising more money and building the business much quicker. Um, so I think there's tons of benefits, but that being said, it's also a risk, right? Because when you bring on a venture studio really early on, as a founder, you kind of put yourself into a position where you can't make the decisions as quickly as you want to. Sometimes you want to talk about it with your team. And I think sometimes it's good. It's much better to have people ask you why not. Sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge because you know deep down you want to do something, but you probably need to speak about it with your co-founding team. So I guess that's a bit of a challenge. There's also the wider risks of resourcing, having a team that's competent, not competent. So I think whenever a founder comes in, it's probably worth doing as much due diligence as possible on the venture studio. Um, what have they done before? Have they had issues? Um, what are some of the products they built? Are the founders who have worked as part of the venture studios portfolio, are they happy with the work that's been done? I think those are all important things founders should ask. And that's just me being rational at this point, right? And that's me speaking as a founder to fellow founders.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess that really shines a light on the whole model and how it works. Thank you for that. So let's wrap up our section about the boot camp. And finally, I guess we want to know when founders finish the boot camp, what will they be able to do next? And I guess for the most important part, what will the winner from the boot camp receive in terms of further support from Paralect?
Yeah, so I guess at the end of the boot camp, ideally the founder would have validated the problem to some extent, built up the earliest bit of traction that they can. So they might have gone from zero people on a wait list or zero people on the database to maybe having 20, 25, 30. And even though that sounds like a really trivial number, having a really good quality of people out there who have bought in and understand the business and can become people you lean on, that's what we want founders to have at the end of it. From there, we kind of expect them to be in a way better position to articulate their business to customers and to investors. So we're not holding anyone's hands to saying, you have to work with us going forward. Hopefully they do want to work with us. Hopefully they go fundraise and then come back to us and say, let's work together. You've got an awesome engineering team. But in many cases, they might not. They might realize having a startup's not for them. They might realize they might need to work on their idea a bit more. Anything like that could happen. Probably what most founders who are coming on are looking forward to is the MVP build. So we want to put founders in the best possible position to speak to investors. So we're basically going to choose one out of the 5 startups after pitch day on the 20th of March, who will get an MVP build from our team. Now, it really depends on the startup, how long that'll be, how detailed the MVP will be, how many features. It really depends. So we can't just say we're going to put a month of time into it. It really depends on the business, and we're going to do our best to help them. And on top of that, we're also going to help with fundraising. So it's not necessarily us putting money into the business, but it's how can we set up the right infrastructure for the business to execute on a good fundraising plan over the next few months. And we're going to work with a couple of partners to help the founders do that.
Awesome. Well, I'm very excited about the program also because I will get to interview a few more founders that take part and let them share their journey at the beginning and middle and end probably of the bootcamp. So stay tuned for those interviews, everyone. But let's talk about Bodii for a little bit before we wrap up because it's your baby, as we say. So you mentioned there that startups very often change their focus in the early days. And in our earlier conversation, you said that Bodii had changed a lot since you founded it. So tell us a little bit about that story. What did the idea start as and what is it now?
Yeah, so I guess high level, Bodii is a healthtech business that helps physiotherapy patients recovering from injury do so with insightful, engaging, and empowering data at hand. That's my sales pitch. But effectively, what we're trying to do is help people have the data at home without having to go into a clinic as regularly. That's a big problem people are facing. So I'll take the UK market, for example. The wait time to go to the National Health Service for physiotherapy averages 45 days. In some cases, people are waiting months for a physiotherapy appointment. In some cases, it's way better. People's alternative is to go to a private clinic, and there they'd be finding themselves paying about 40 to 60 pounds for a 30-minute session. Most people can't afford a sustainable recovery plan of going to a clinic, getting that rapid advice. So what that creates is that be it the public hospital or private clinics, they tend to give people plans as with any fitness trainer to go away, do your recovery plan and come back in a few weeks and we'll see how you're doing. And the drop-off rate of people actually doing it and not doing it is about 70%. So 70% of people actually just drop off their plan. And that's the problem we want to solve. So I ended up interviewing a lot of people who were in that situation, and the biggest reason why people drop off is purely because they don't know whether they're getting better. So they have no feedback on how they're progressing. So our goal from there was to figure out how we can help people um, visualize that data as easily as possible without going in. So that's the whole premise of what we're doing. In terms of how we've developed since it was conceived, um, it was actually a laughable concept that I started with, and a lot of people who are close to me know I spoke about robots when I started off with Bodii, which is quite funny. But it was all to solve the same problem. So when I first had the idea, it was purely because I was recovering from my own injury, and I didn't really want to pay a lot of money to go into a physio clinic regularly. So I was like, I need to develop a robot that can help me at home. So you can see that the premise is the same. The approach was really vague, but I think what happened from there was kind of what I'll be speaking to founders with on the bootcamp, is that let's bring it down a little. Let's go talk to people who are in the same position. What was the struggle they're facing? What were the barriers? Why didn't they go into a clinic? What were they looking for? And I think going through that process, we went from an idea for robots to an idea of creating massage and manual therapy devices to then going to progress trackers, which is not currently available. And it's a much more interesting space, and it's something that we've now seen add so much value. And I think going through that process of problem validation, speaking to customers, is how we got there.
Okay. But going off of what's on the site, go check it out. It's bodii.uk, bodii.uk. It appears that it's a very, very niche product at the moment. It is a piece of small, simple hardware that goes around right below the knee.
Yep.
And the app that it connects to on your phone. So is it specifically just to track progress in rehab from knee injuries? And is that sort of just the beginning, or what's your vision for that?
100% just the beginning. It's so easy to try to do too much and solve many problems. What we wanted to do is figure out problem that we're close with, that I can resonate with and really have an impact on, but find a market within this industry that is big enough for us to actually have a good test case on. So we focused on people with knee injuries. I started the business on the back of my own knee injuries. I tore the ligaments in my knee 3 times by the time I was about 22. So that's why we focused on it. But I think that the market size is big in itself. In the UK alone, there's about 126,000 people recovering from knee surgeries. In the US, it's going to rise to about 7 million in the next 5 years. And that's if we only stayed on people with knee injuries. But we found that to be a really good starting niche. Now, you say that it's a piece of hardware with an app. Now, our hardware is actually functional across any part of the body. So if we wanted to measure range of movement in someone's arm, for example, or hip, we could actually do that. It's just a bit of maths that we need to figure out. But then we're opening ourselves to about 10 other markets instead of actually getting it right with one and making all the learnings with one. And I think that's where, as a founder, you've probably got to be a bit careful of not trying to do too much at the beginning when you're probably constrained. If we had millions and millions in funding, probably we might have looked at it, but we want to get it right, do as much of learnings as we can, probably get into market, solve problems for a wide group of people, and then be able to expand. And I think that's the approach I decided to take as a founder.
Okay. Yeah, that's makes a lot of sense. So how do you go about getting people, I guess, to know about and use Bodii? Are you going via physiotherapists? for them to recommend it to their clients? Are you going direct to people who Google, how do I recover from my knee surgery?
Yeah, so right now we're going through physiotherapists. So we haven't released into market yet. There's a few nuances. There's a few challenges with hardware devices that you've got to tackle. One, for it to not be tacky. Two, for it to actually work and offer value. And then being able to connect it to an app and demonstrate the data that's actually meaningful to people. That's quite a challenge. So we're going to be running tests with a local university. We're going to be working with the National Health Services Innovation Agency up here in the northwest of the UK to get all of those components right. But I've already built a pipeline of physios that we can work with to kind of get the referrals out to patients. And that's going to be our big channel. Although I see the business as a long-term B2C, we're actually going to start off in the B2B plus referral space, purely because we need to get good exposure with physiotherapists. Because if you've got a physio who's saying that this actually doesn't work, it's a gimmick, when the business dies, they're then. So it's about offering enough value to them for them to see that it's better than the current alternatives, working with them to fine tune the products, and then really getting mass out to market to patients.
All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense as well. I guess my perspective, looking at the whole health and fitness connected wearable space, we can dive in a little bit, as you mentioned, to the data challenges. I've been a sort of amateur runner and cyclist, so it seems really messy to me. I've been using different devices to track activity via GPS, via different apps over the last 10 years or so. And I guess there are a lot of semi-closed ecosystems for this fitness data, and they don't really play nicely together, has been my experience. And it's hard to sort of get a holistic view of sort of everything you do from a health and fitness perspective. So I'm curious to hear your take on this. Are you thinking of ways to integrate with larger health apps or platforms in the future?
Yeah, so I want to stay away from being considered a fitness product because it's not necessarily a fitness device or a fitness tracker. And it's really good to categorize them as two different things. So you think of products like Whoop, Oura Rings, any form of smartwatch. They all help with fitness tracking, so day-to-day activity of people. We are focused on solving a problem for people recovering from injuries. So it's more of a health problem that people are facing. It's access to physiotherapy, it's access to a physiotherapist, access to a doctor that they're facing, and they need to bridge that gap. So it's important to kind of split the two things. You're absolutely right. There's tons of data. And probably if you take the data from our device and you take the data from your smartwatch and your Oura Ring that tells you how long you've slept, you could probably put it all together and get a really good assessment of someone's overall health and recovery. And the biggest health challenge over the next few years is figuring out how to aggregate that and make it as easily not accessible but consumable for a person, for the average person, right? The great thing is that people are much more comfortable interacting with devices at home, so that kind of bodes well with us. And they're much more inclined to look for ways to improve their health, and that's a trend that we're seeing. You could probably go to someone over the age of about 60. I'll probably refer to people like my parents, for example, who'll be like, why would I want to track this? I've gone 60 years without ever tracking my health data, and it's not important. A lot of younger people see a lot of benefit in it. And I think the biggest opportunity in the health space is for companies who can bring together the information. I think from Bodii's perspective, we're not going to try to fall into the trap of trying to be that aggregator. But but there are tools that we can use to bring in the information. So I've seen a few different startups out there who have created APIs where I can bring in information from my Samsung Health or my whatever the Apple one is. I'm an Android user. Um, that you can bring them into your health app, and you can bring all the information together. It's a growing market, and there are businesses doing that out there. And I think you say it's really difficult now, but I think in the next few years, you're probably going to see businesses do it really well. I spoke to a founder of a startup that's actually using text messages to aggregate health information. And I spoke to him a couple of days ago, and it's really interesting because you could probably find about 4 or 5 different sources of health information about yourself, but it's so difficult to consume it all at the same time, and you're getting confounding messages. You're getting so much information that you just don't care, and you're going to open that bottle of wine and sit down and drink it anyway and stay up till 2 in the morning. So it's an interesting space, and I think we're not going to fall into that trap of being an add-on.
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of startups sort of tackling this problem that I've had. My only piece of advice for people that want to get more into whether it's health tracking or fitness tracking or sports tracking is just stay within one brand's sort of ecosystem as much as possible, whether it's Garmin, whether it's Apple, whether it's whoever it is. Because once you start mixing sort of data sources, it doesn't work out that well. All right, but back to Bodii. You mentioned in one post that I saw that you're not a domain expert in terms of physiotherapy, but you've got a startup that is serving physiotherapists and people that are getting physiotherapy for this any kind of knee injury. So what was your sort of learnings from that experience?
It was really difficult to begin with because it's starting at day 0. You have no network in the industry. You've got no one to go off. You just know there's a problem there, and you need to figure out and become a domain expert yourself. I don't think I'm domain expert at all by any means, but I think what I've been able to do over the past year and a half is build up a strong network of people I can ask questions to. I experienced the problem myself for about 4 years before starting the business, and that's not enough to start a business and be able to execute on it. But I guess over the 4 years, I started to speak to a lot of people, speak to a lot of patients out there who have gone through the problem, build up a tiny network of physios, of doctors that I can start to reach out to. And I think that was the best starting point for me, reaching out to them, building a strong relationship from them, asking them if they know other doctors or physios who'd like to talk to me. And I think going through that process, I could probably say I've got about 30 or 40 physios in my network now. I probably wouldn't say I'm friends with all of them. I'm probably friends with about 10 of them. But that's way more than I had when I first started the idea, right? And that makes up, I think that makes up for me not having the domain expertise. I'm really open-minded. I try to learn. I'm never going to say that I have the right answers, but I think there's a lot of founders who will be in that position. And investors will always say, yeah, but you don't have the domain expertise. And then you can say, yeah, but I did this. I spoke to all the people in the industry. I've got validation from experts, people who have been in the industry for 30 years. They want to work with us. There's always ways to tackle the domain expertise issue. It helps being a domain expert. It helps being a vet who wants to solve a problem in the veterinary industry. But there's other ways you can go about it. So it should never be a bottleneck, really.
Right. And another longtime partner of Parallax, he's got a Substack where he writes about his experience, and it's called Let's Build, I think. Anyway, he mentioned that domain expertise, if it's very strong in a founder, it can sometimes act like blinders. They sort of get tunnel vision on the problem as they see it, as they've seen it over the years, and they sort of build the solution that's in their head without taking into consideration enough input from other people that may have had slightly different experiences from them in the same domain.
I think for a founder, being naive really helps, because going into another industry fresh, you can add a lot, because I understood tech a fair bit coming into the physiotherapy industry, and I knew that there were ways where we could solve problems. And I guess if you're a physio, you might not necessarily know that. And I think when I speak to some physios and say, oh, we could probably do this way better than it's currently being done, that naivety really helps, because you probably ask different questions to what they might already know. But then you also get humbled a lot. So you'll say, could it be done this way? And they'll be like, no, you can't do that. And you're like, fair enough. But at least 1 out of 10 times you might find something that's really cool. And I think not having domain expertise can also act in your favor, because you look at it from a completely fresh perspective.
Yeah. Speaking of perspectives, let's say there's a founder in the first cohort or second cohort of the bootcamp who wants to build something similar, not similar to Bodii, but a hardware connected product. Do you have any sort of advice for them from your experience with Bodii that comes to mind?
Um, Probably have another 2 hour review of that. At the beginning, I tried to jump straight to finding a co-founder who could build a product I had in mind, and that was a big mistake. Brought on two co-founders. Both relationships didn't work out, but I wasted a lot of time in doing that, because I did that before actually speaking to customers. So I think the biggest advice is try to figure out what problem you're solving, whether hardware is even the right way to go about solving that, because most often it's not. Trying to build a hardware startup is a lengthy process, because you've got to do product testing, you've got to get electronics to work, you've got to get your supply chain, you've got to go through regulations if you're doing something completely new. You've got to figure out who the right people to work with are, IP attorneys, all these type of things that might not necessarily work in your favor, might not necessarily move smoothly if you're building something that's actually adding no value. So if you speak to no customers and spend 2 years doing that, instead of actually figuring out what it is that's adding value, making sure that there are people that want it, and then embarking on that journey, that's probably the biggest advice that I would give.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But I'm still figuring it out as I go on. So don't take my word for it.
All right. All right. And it's interesting to just think about hardware and how even like wildly successful things can be off the market in a relatively short period of time. Like the iPod is the first example that springs to mind. It was a hit. It changed the way we listen to music. It helped pave the way for the smartphone, but you can't buy a new one anymore. It's already done. So it's interesting. All right. I guess last question for you about Bodii. What does success look like for Bodii maybe 6 months or a year from now? What is your next sort of vision or goal or milestone?
So in 6 months, I'd like to see our devices in physio's hands. And we would have made sales by getting it there. We have gone through a lot of discovery, a lot of product development, figuring out what value we're going to add. We did a lot of testing, and right now we're in a position where we need to really fine tune our mobile application, so that it's workable on the Play Store, and the App Store. And we need to get our first batch of delivery of units. And I think I'm confident that within 6 months we can achieve that, and hopefully get it into the hands of physios. That's what success in 6 months looks like for me. A year from now, I'd like to see us referring. I'd like to see physios referring patients on. I think that's where I'd like the business to be.
Awesome. Well, Chris, it's already been over an hour, so thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure I'll talk to you again about the boot camp in the future. Good luck talking with the founders, and by the time this comes out, we will probably have our 5 startups already lined up for the first cohort. So see you around, and it's been really informative talking to you. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you.